The things that we were doing, we were spending quite a bit of time talking about the plasma membrane and these proteins that are embedded in the membrane. When I kind of draw the line flushing the toilet. Okay, so we learned that in this cell, animal cell that we're going to have this wonderful plasma membrane. That plasma membrane has a lot of stuff embedded into it, and we've gone over stuff such as our attachment proteins, our transport proteins. We've looked at the channel proteins, the ones that are gated, non-gated, gated ligand, voltage gated. We've looked at carrier proteins. We stopped at this point right here with the carrier proteins, where we were talking about they could be either one movement in one direction, moving two in the same direction, or being antiport, which is going to move one in one direction, one in the other. These particular types right here, those are going to be very important when we begin to look at the kidneys. But you don't even do that to part 2. Okay? So the next type that we're going to find in the plasma membrane is the one that's ATP powered. Does that ring a bell? What does it ring a bell for, Nicole?
For energy. That's how the cells produce energy. Or
energy is ATP. So if the protein requires energy, what type of protein are we familiar with it being? Does this ring a bell? The sodium potassium pump. Now, what I'm going to do, okay, try to make this a little bit easier. I'm going to turn that thing off. We're going to use the board for a few minutes, and we're going to talk about these proteins. And I'm going to give you an example of the proteins, because that's the best way I know of how to teach you about these proteins. Now, just real quickly, receptor proteins. These are going to be the ones where you're going to see something have to fit into the shape of this protein, and that's going to come in later chapters. But let's look at what's going to happen if we take all of these proteins that we have learned about, okay, the ones that are going to be gated, non-gated, ligand, voltage gated, channel, okay, let's take a peek at what can happen at a plasma membrane of a cell. So let's turn this off, because I'm going to use the board. I'm going to revert back to my early teacher days, but then that's when I had chalk and the actual blackboard where you could scratch your fingernails across it, and you would be like, okay. Now, at this point in time, I've mentioned this wonderful plasma membrane. We have spent about 18 slides on it. Okay? What does it all mean? For every cell that we're going to talk about, everything's going to take place at the cellular level. Now, that means we are going to have to encounter this wonderful plasma membrane. We're going to have to encounter all of the proteins that are embedded into it. So, for the purposes that we have right now, in part 1 of anatomy and physiology, people most of the time think about, oh, you're going to learn the bones and the muscles. It's a little more than that. But we've got a lot of systems to cover, not in part 1, but part 1, part 2. And we're going to look at this based on muscle contraction. Skeletal muscle contraction. What does it require for a skeletal muscle to contract? What is needed? Electrolytes are going to be important. But let's say that as I'm doing this right now across the floor, as I'm walking around, what has generated the ability for me to do this? Somewhere in my frontal lobe, it's been thought about. I've been thinking about the fact that I'm going to walk across the floor as you all sit here right now. In your frontal lobe, you know that at 3:15, I'm going to say, take a break, be back at 3:30, and kapowie, you're going to be out of that chair through that door in no time flat. Okay? That thought is already preparing the nerve that is going to innervate the muscle to move. It is already preparing the impulse. The way that skeletal muscle is structured, every cell of skeletal muscle is innervated. All right? Now, what does that exactly mean? I just purposely handed the paper over. I used groups of muscles to do that, correct? That group of muscles, biceps, triceps, deltoid, pecs, brachioradialis. Everybody kind of following me, okay? That group of fibers makes a muscle. Okay? The sartorius, right here, my leg. Okay? Longest muscle in my body. This is a group of cells. The difference is it's a muscle fiber. Muscle fiber is a muscle cell. I know, a little confusing right now. This muscle as a whole is fed by a large nerve. That nerve will enter into this muscle at a certain point. Okay? When it enters into this muscle, it begins to branch. and it will feed every single fiber. Every fiber of this muscle has a nerve feeding it. So if I were to be able to take this and peel it down and get one fiber, which would be one cell, okay, at some point it's being fed by a nerve. For that muscle to contract and move, it has to receive the impulse from the nerve, and it has to have enough of an impulse for it to contract and make me move. Does that make sense? So, let's think about this muscle cell, okay? Let's say that this is the membrane around that muscle fiber, okay? And that's going to contain my lipid bilayer. Because I just told you that for every fiber it's innervated, I'm going to have a nerve coming into it. And that nerve, since I'm talking about since I use the sartorius, okay, that nerve feeds into the spinal cord, up the central nervous system, blah, 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 okay? If that's the case, and I just said that somewhere in my frontal lobe, it's starting the process for this muscle to move, okay? That means up here, I'm starting those electrical impulses. They're going to have to travel that nerve that feeds that muscle to affect those fibers. So that tells me that I'm going to have a relationship between the nerve and the muscle. This is a cell. This that I'm going to draw all the way across the board is one cell. Now, if that's the case, right here with my nerve, the only product it can produce is what? A protein. In my nervous system, what is the name for those proteins? They are called neurotransmitters. Neuro, nerve, okay? They transmit a signal. In this case, because I'm looking at nerve to skeletal muscle, my neurotransmitter that will be released is acetylcholine. Now, here's what's going to happen. On my muscle, all right, my little plasma membrane, it's going to dip in and continue forward. Now, at the point where my nerve meets the muscle, there's going to exist in that area thousands upon thousands of one type of the proteins that we have discussed.